I want to talk about conversion and enrichment. Okay, so why don't we kick off with definitions? I think that's always quite good. And then we're going to talk about what that market's looked like over the last, well, say 10 years and certainly 5 years. So if you don't mind, give us a description of what each of those is.
Okay, so definitions. Conversion is a service that is applied to U3O8 or yellow cake or uranium concentrate to take it from a yellow cake powder into a refined gas, UF6, uranium hexafluoride. And the reason why you need it in that format is the enrichment process, and again, enrichment is a service that's applied to the UF6, is that the centrifugal enrichment technology takes that gas, spins it at an incredible speed, 2 times the speed of sound, and because of that, it slowly shakes out the heavier isotopes of uranium towards the edges, so the lighter isotopes of uranium can be sucked from the middle of the centrifuge. So the reason why you need to do that, and we're going into a simple physics lesson here, is uranium's predominantly 2 isotopes, uranium-238 and uranium-235. Only uranium-235 is fissile. In other words, it can be utilised as a chain reaction to release energy, as it is in a controlled way in a nuclear power plant. Uranium-235 is only present in a concentration of 0.7% in natural uranium. And for a conventional nuclear power plant, it needs to be upgraded to somewhere between 3 and 5%, depending on that technology. And that's what the enrichment process does. So what has happened in the last 10 years in particular? If we were to go back 10 years, we had a situation where those services of conversion and enrichment were applied to uranium owned by utilities. So the utility would contract with a major producer, let's say Rossing in Namibia, and they would own the U3O8. They'd then take it to the converter, pay the converter for the service of conversion, and then the utility would own the UF6. Then when they're ready to, they'd take that UF6, deliver it to the enricher, pay the enrichment facility for the service of enrichment, and then they would be left with a certain quantity of the EUP, which is enriched uranium product, that's appropriate to the type of technology that they need. So for a particular reactor, they might need it to 3.7%, and that's what they would ask the enricher to provide. Now, the way that that would work is the service of enrichment is called a SWU, separative work unit, not that anyone really needs to understand that for now. And SWU prices fluctuate in the same way that uranium prices fluctuate, and the utility would try and optimize how much SWU they add to how much uranium to produce the product. And they do that by comparing the uranium price with the SWU price. Because if you've got very expensive uranium and very cheap SWU, then what you're going to do is you're going to keep providing that SWU in those centrifuges until you've squeezed every last bit of uranium out of it. Conversely, if the SWU is very expensive and the uranium's quite cheap, you're going to give it more of a light touch with the SWU because you'd rather buy more uranium and push more uranium through and extract less efficiency from that uranium. And what you end up with is this trade-off that determines the tails assay, the optimum tails assay. I'll come back to why this is important. Once you know a tails assay, then you know how much of this EUP, enriched uranium product, you're going to have as a utility at the end of it, and you can also then use that to calculate how much more uranium you need to buy. That was 10 years ago. Then we had Fukushima. Now what Fukushima did is it, in a matter of months, knocked out about 10% of the world's demand for nuclear power and therefore nuclear fuel. Conversion facilities, they can flex up a little bit and down, but an enrichment facility can't flex down because these centrifuges, imagine an oversized scuba tank that's spinning at this rate. I've been told that if you allowed it to stop and you had a speck of dust in it, when you restarted it, they spin at such a rate that speck of dust would cause it to lose balance and fire like a rocket through your entire plant.
Wow.
So you simply can't turn them off until you're ready to shut them down and say goodbye to that particular centrifuge. So they just had to run them. They had no choice. So going back to the example that I gave, or the explanation that I gave about optimum tails assays, the utilities were still saying, right, we've done our calculation and you quoted us on SWU and we know we bought our uranium for that much and therefore we want an optimum tail assay of this. And that's what the enricher would provide. But it had 10% or more of this excess capacity. So they said, well, with what we've got left, we'll just leave it in for a bit longer. And even though it's really low grade uranium by that point, we're paying the electricity and the sunk capital cost to keep running these centrifuges anyway. So we'll leave it in there and we'll squeeze every last little bit of useful uranium that the technology allows, and we get to keep that. And what they did is they kept that extra enriched uranium product and they used that to try and offset some of their own costs. And that is the concept of underfeeding that today is responsible for almost 20 million pounds of uranium supply into the marketplace. So that's where uranium conversion and enrichment fit in. And then one last comment about the enrichment side of things and underfeeding. We are seeing underfeeding decrease relatively quickly because, number one, we've got increasing demand for nuclear fuel. There's now more reactors operating today and a greater nuclear power output than there was before Fukushima. So we've closed up that demand gap. And also the enrichment facilities have been under a lot of economic stress since those days. And as they start to decommission these centrifuges in their cascades, they're not replacing them. So there's been some natural attrition in their centrifuge cascades that's led to reduced capacity. So those two factors result in a stark reduction in underfeeding by 2025 and almost elimination of underfeeding by 2035 at a time when nuclear power is still growing at a couple of % compound average growth rate.
Thanks for that. That's a wonderful breakdown. So let's just stay with the supply side of things just a little bit longer, if you can. You know, and we have talked in the past on other conversations we've had with regards to, you know, how much UF6 there was in the market, how much EUP was actually in the market, and because it's a small market but fairly opaque market, I think there was a severe underestimation about the impact of both of those components in the marketplace, and it's perhaps the reason why some of these estimates have been long drawn out or long misestimated. Where are they now? UF6 today, are supplies dwindling? Are they nearing the bottom? How long can we expect to see this thing carry on?
Great question, and maybe I'll go back a little bit in time to contextualize my answer. And the other effect, apart from the creation of underfeeding after Fukushima, the other effect is that the excess capacity applied in conversion as well, and we saw utilities that had already paid for uranium and conversion fulfilling those obligations and producing UF6 that they didn't really need, particularly Japanese utilities. So we saw the build-up of inventory in UF6 as well as EUP, the enriched uranium product. So previously, where conversion was simply a service and enrichment was simply a service applied to the uranium owned by the utilities, now we started to see fresh uranium, inventory uranium, and inventory UF6 as well as inventory EUP. And as you just explained, that's created a great degree of opaqueness in understanding inventories. And it's also enabled utilities until very recently to be able to arbitrage between those three forms of fuel. So if you didn't like the uranium price, you could go and buy UF6, or if you didn't like the UF6 price, you could buy EUP or uranium. So to answer your question, what we've seen in UF6 is a dramatic reduction in the available and mobile inventory. So the inventory of UF6 that isn't already owned by people who need it is very, very low. And the reason for that is in November 2017, Converdyne, a large provider of conversion services, put onto care and maintenance the Metropolis Works facility, which is the only conversion facility in the US. And very cleverly and very stealthily, they mopped up pretty much all of the available UF6 in the market at that point in time. And they did that because they had contracts of conversion. So by buying the UF6 in advance, they could, instead of providing the service of conversion, they could just slowly deliver that UF6 to their counterparties. Now we fast forward by a couple of years, 2.5 years, and we've got a situation where that UF6 has been absorbed. There's been a deficit in conversion since that facility was closed. And as a result, that inventory's been soaked up in UF6. We've seen a skyrocketing conversion price. So the price of that service has gone from roughly $4 to $20 a kilogram, a tremendous rise, which has obviously had an effect on the UF6 price, but also reminded utilities that we are in an awfully volatile market, and exactly the same thing can happen to uranium. And the knock-on effects are already becoming clear. It hasn't hit uranium yet, but it has hit enrichment. So the SWU price has gone from low 30s to about $50 per SWU. So a good, healthy increase in more recent times that again is just putting pressure on the utilities' decision-making when it comes to uranium.